Welcome to Smalltalk Daily for Tuesday, April 6th, 2010. Yesterday I had a question come up in my chatback widget about using the tab widget to switch the contents of a UI based on tabs changing. So I thought I'd go through that a little bit today. In Bottom Feeder I have a fairly simple example of this, so let me show you what I'm talking about. I have a feed and an item selected. I right click on the item Properties, and I get a little UI up with two tabs. General, which just gives me some general information like the link and the identifier. I go to Details and it gives me some HTML on things like the pingback address and the link and so on and so forth. So as I switch tabs, the view changes. I've got a slightly more involved one. If I go over here to the feed and do feed properties, I have a few more tabs like settings for that individual feed and some general information, some details which gives me an HTML view of it, and then the feed encoding, which gives me the feed encoding for this. So a whole bunch of interesting things that I can do swapping the view depending on the tab that's selected. So let's go back to that simple one here, the item properties one, because that's a fairly small example and easy to grasp. So we'll go in here to the browser. I have my item properties, and if I go to the UI, you see over here in interface specs, I have three things. I have the window spec, which has the UI with the tabs. And then I have the general spec, which I've laid out with these fields, and I have the detail spec. So the first thing is you need to lay out all your specs, the ones you're going to use. And then over here on the instance side, you see that under private, I have a spec array, which is the specs I'm going to use because I'm going to index into that as I change specs. So I'm indexing into that every time I change the spec. And over here in interface opening and post build with, I send this tabs changed. And that's so that the first time I open the UI, I can go ahead and adjust the tabs to show some default information, probably the first tab. So I'll go and find tabs changed. And here's what's happening. I go and look for the index of the selected tab. I index into the spec array, which you saw a moment ago. And then I send builder component at, that's the ID of the tab widget, client, and then the spec is self-spec array at in the index. And then I just go ahead and set that up. And that spec array is saved on the class side, so it'll know to look in this class for that UI, and it'll just swap that in. And here's some more code that's specific to this interface. But this is the key right here. After you index into your spec array, you just go ahead and set that up this way. Now the other thing you might ask is, how do I change things as the tabs are changed? Well, if you go here into aspects, you notice that I have my tabs. This is generated. And I just changed this selection list with self-label array. And label array is just, if I go ahead and do implementers of label array, you don't see what I'm doing, but if I go ahead and grab that, you see over here in item properties, I have this array with this. So I have, this is all internationalized, but it's general and detail. So it's just an array of two strings. So it matches the spec array. So I have strings matched to the actual specs. And down here, what I do is I have the selection index holder on change send, tabs changed. So every time I select a tab, it's going to go ahead and send tabs changed. And when I get tabs changed, under here in changing, that's when I go through this mess and I remap over into the appropriate spec. And that's how you operate these kinds of tab control widgets. And it's very similar regardless of what kind of widget what kind of things you're swapping in. You set up your specs for the individual tab fields, and then you just write code that's going to look an awful lot like this every time through. And that's really all there is to it. So, until next time, have fun with Smalltalk.